Good afternoon, everyone. Good evening for those who are joining us online, or good morning, depending on where you are. Welcome to Periworld House, the University of Pennsylvania's hub for global engagement. I'm Zaid Rad Al-Hussein, the Periworld House professor of the practice of law and human rights. And I'm delighted to introduce a very special conversation today, which comes at a timely moment for the US and the world. The media landscape is fast evolving and presents new challenges to a right that is enshrined in the US Constitution, the right to freedom of expression. The speed, the scale, and the quality of information flows are being reshaped. Disinformation and information manipulation are being weaponized in all aspects of society, including for electoral purposes. The legitimacy of traditional and established sources of information seem to be questioned more than ever. What does this evolving media landscape mean for the protection and the promotion of freedom of expression in democracies? What broader implications does a technological transformation have for human rights around the world? And to answer these two questions and many more, we're delighted to have a wonderful speaker today. David Kaye, a Periworld House Distinguished Fellow, is a law professor at the University of California, Irvine, the independent expert of the United States to the Venice Commission, and an affiliated scholar at Oxford University's Bonavero Institute for Human Rights and Lund University's Raoul Wallenberg Institute for Human Rights and International Humanitarian Law. From 2014 to 2020, he served as the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of the right to freedom of opinion and expression. He is the author of Speech Police, The Global Struggle to Govern the Internet, a trustee of Article 19, served as independent chair of the board of the Global Network Initiative, and was the 2023-2024 Fulbright Distinguished Scholar in Public International Law at Lund University, Sweden. He writes regularly for international and American law journals and media outlets. David began his legal career with the U.S. State Department's Office of the Legal Advisor and is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Our moderator is known to all of us, will be Sarah Bennett Weiser, the Walter H. Annenberg Dean of the Annenberg School for Communication here at Penn, and it's Lauren Berlant, Professor of Communication. In addition, she's a research professor at the University of Southern California, California's Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism, and the founding director of the Center for Collaborative Communication at the Annenberg Schools. Her teaching and research interests include gender in the media, identity, citizenship, and cultural politics, consumer culture and popular media, race and the media, and intersectional feminism. I need to draw breath. That was a long, long introduction. Now, please join me in welcoming our distinguished speakers to the stage.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear? Is this on? Well, we were just talking about the possibility of grandkids. So now we're going to switch to a different topic and talk about freedom of expression, which, actually isn't that different necessarily. But I'm really happy to be here with you in conversation. And I thought that I would start off with just asking you to kind of go over what you think some of the sort of cultural trajectory of both the utopic and dystopic understandings of the internet and the role that freedom of expression plays. I was thinking about this conversation and I was remembering fondly and with great nostalgia about the feminist blogosphere of the 1990s, which was like this space that felt so much about freedom of expression and so much about gatekeepers being gone, or at least being lessened for people, for women, young women, to express their feelings about patriarchy, about misogyny, about all of that. And now it's, the blogosphere is not dead, but the feminist blogosphere is, has definitely subsided. And it's been really tough to keep pace with technological development. The development happens so fast that we can't really keep up. And now it feels very dystopic. So that time from utopia to dystopia wasn't as long as it was, let's say, with like the telegraph.
No. So that is a great way to start. Although starting with children just reminds me that, so I do free speech, freedom of expression around the world. My family thinks it's ironic because they're like, why are you shutting us down? Anyway, so no, I love the framing. So, and also thank you, Zaid, Michael, everybody at Perry World House, Colleen, for allowing this week to happen, for me to be here. So, yeah, I think if we want to think about sort of the development of the last 30 years online, it's actually, the way you put it, I haven't really articulated or thought about this way, but I'm really glad the way you put it. I think one way to think about the cultural debates around freedom of expression, around free speech, is almost as a kind of distortion that's been created by online life. And the distortion is this, right? So if we go back to the 80s and 90s, some of you might remember there was this Declaration of Independence on Cyberspace by John Perry Barlow, who was a lyricist for the Grateful Dead, also one of the founders of the Electronic Frontier Foundation. And the idea, the early vision of the internet, which was really in the blogosphere, in every different element of it, it was a democratization of speech. It was this openness to, like, everybody would have a platform. And that's beautiful in a lot of ways, right? And like, really beautiful. Benjamin Barber, in the late 90s, he actually saw the problem that was coming. And that's maybe the pivot here from utopia to dystopia. He saw where the problem was going, which was corporate capture. And the question was going to be not just corporate capture, but government capture. And would the internet be genuinely democratic? And if we think about the development of online speech over the last 30 years, it's been one of a move from kind of individual blogosphere. Remember, like, I don't know if anybody remembers what it was like to be in that moment when you'd be reading one blog and there'd be a dozen hyperlinks, and that would lead you one place and then to another place. And then, like, 4 hours later, you were in some place, some exotic, you were in Bali looking up hotels or whatever it was. You were, following, and you were driven, but you were a consumer. And the idea, I think, maybe the way to think about from utopia to dystopia is to think that focus on the individual as the speaker, only really captured one aspect of freedom of expression. But it's the dominant cultural view of free speech. You see it in the way Elon Musk talks about free speech, which is like there should be no limit on the speaker, which, like, I am relatively sympathetic to that, but it totally neglects what the blogosphere also offered, which was our rights as audiences, our rights as seekers of information. And so if you think about, and I'll just sort of end sort of on the cultural side here, cultural/legal. I think the American cultural environment is dominated by a speaker-driven way of thinking about free speech. And part of that is because the First Amendment says Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech or of the press. It's about the speaker, at least in the sort of on its surface. Freedom of expression as a human right guaranteed by Article 19 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights guarantees everyone's right to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers, through any media. And I think that added element, which is sort of the human rights culture, which often creates a kind of clash between the speaker as everything kind of model versus the audience has rights also of access to information, of like the ability to communicate with others and all that. Like that's lost in our cultural debate. And so I think there is something to this dystopic environment, which is oddly driven by a human rights framing, which is the speaker has rights, but it neglects the audience.
Yeah, that's super interesting. When you're talking, I was reminded of there was an old ad for e-commerce back when e-commerce was something novel and interesting, and people were like, "Oh, look what we could do!" And it was this ad where, these like two guys are sitting around a computer and they push like send it, to launch their product, and you see the ticker go up and it's like, oh, we sold one. And then it goes up again and they're like, we sold two. And then it just keeps going up and up and up until the thousands. And they were just like, uh-oh, what do we do now? Right. And I sort of think that consumer model is also what can be seen as like, I don't know, like a metaphor for what's happening with internet communication. It used to be, this idea that the gatekeeping was at least, kind of lessened, that you could have freedom of expression. But because it is driven by profit, because our platforms, the major platforms that we have, are all owned by billionaires, that there is, you call it in your writing, an information diet, right? That our information diet is completely curated by them, right? And they're driven, among other things, by profit. And so this idea of the individual kind of centered understanding of freedom of speech makes sense in a capitalist framework. The individual is key, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, and when you're going back to old ads, I mean, everybody will remember the New Yorker cartoon, right?
Yeah.
Probably even in your mind, what I'm going to allude to, which is, the dog on the computer, on the internet. Nobody knows you're a dog. So the utopia, this isn't a utopia about dogs, although my utopia would involve a lot of dogs. But the utopia is of anonymity and privacy. And one of the things that also changed with the corporatization of the internet was the end of privacy and the end of anonymity. So there's it's funny because when that cartoon came out, it was real. Like that was actually, you could experience, I mean, there was pseudonymity, but nobody really knew how to break through and find out who was the actual author, who was browsing or whatnot. But now there really is, I mean, you have to work really hard to be anonymous online. And that again goes back to like the protection of the individual who wants to do some search, right? So you want to search something about, I don't know, maybe it's about gender identity, or it's about your ethnic heritage, and you're in a place that's conservative. So you want to protect your privacy from that. Well, 30 years ago, you could do that relatively easily. Now it's virtually impossible because of both the corporate side, but also the government use of tools to undermine that. And again, that goes to like, what rights do we as audiences, or we as seekers of information, not just, tweeters or posters, but people like trying to use the internet to gather information. It's much harder to do it in a way that's protective.
Yeah. So what you just said now makes me think of another question that's not in my question. So, about anonymity. There are lots of communication studies that talk about how it is that anonymity, or the fact that you don't have to look at someone when you are launching an insult or being racist or being misogynist, that anonymity or lack of accountability gives people a shield. And so I think that what you're pointing to is a really interesting tension. There's privacy as we used to define it no longer exists, right? You kind of exist, at least in the US, you exist forever on the internet. I mean, there are some kind of rights to forget in other places, but at the same, so their privacy is different, but at the same time, there's maybe not anonymity, but there's a lack of accountability. And so this idea of tweeters or posters being different than audience members. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that. I've done a lot of work on comments and the sort of damage that comments have done, especially with young women and self-esteem and that kind of thing, when it's so easy to body shame. It's so easy to launch a threat, a violent threat, because there isn't an accountability, and yet the young woman who it's the comments are directed towards doesn't have privacy.
So I agree. This is one of the great tensions that the internet poses to us. Anonymity it's a great example because, you can think of it from two sides of that coin, right? On the one hand, so it was like 10, 15 years ago, you remember Facebook had and still has a real name policy, right? And so that real name policy comes from, this idea for authenticity and for some sense of accountability and responsibility. It also has to do with the corporate side and their business model. But it worked really against, in particular, LGBTQI communities. Yeah. And so the tension there is, on the one hand, anonymity provides a way for people to attack others with some cone of protection for the attacker. But it also provides a way for people to engage in community in a way that they might not be able to in a normal public space. So Facebook actually modified its policy a bit to deal with this problem. But I agree that it's a built-in tension. But it actually gets to the broader problem, which you were alluding to before, around gatekeeping, right? Because the gatekeeper, if the gatekeepers in the old days, we were talking about this the other day, right? The gatekeepers in the old days were like basically a set of, white men at three outlets, CBS, NBC, ABC, and that was it. Like that, I mean, of course there was print. Print had a much bigger, I mean, you know this far better than I do, but print had a much bigger footprint in our society. But with the internet, and particularly with social media and with search, these new gatekeepers don't have the same kind of public interest orientation. And so, like the argument, if you were arguing about anonymity with one of the old gatekeepers, it would probably be an argument around public interest. Mm-hmm. But the argument with the new gatekeepers is much more an argument that, like, from their side, the public interest isn't really relevant. Right. So we're arguing on our side about protection of women, particularly like young women journalists and young women who are facing all sorts of threats online. And that's sort of an individual, but also a public interest argument. Whereas from their perspective, from the new gatekeeper's perspective, it's about how does this mess with our business model? Like if we take this policy, they don't really care about the broader social impact. They care about, well, is this going to enable us or disable us or make it harder for us to track individual preferences so we can sell them products or essentially sell them? I mean, I'm not saying anything new here. Sell them as products to advertisers. That's a totally different, I mean, really dystopic conversation to have. But that's, so that old tension, which is individuals and a public interest, has been distorted in quite a lot of ways.
Yeah, and I think that the other side of the coin of the anonymity being you're both a target and you can find community is visibility, right? That visibility online, it's a trap, right? It can make you feel like part of a community. You can see yourself in a way that matters in a culture where mattering means everything, but it also makes you a target, especially for those marginalized individuals, that then the focus becomes on them. So I think that that's a really interesting tension that we still need to kind of figure out. But what I wanted to, I think that, I know this seems kind of silly, but I think we forget to remind ourselves about the public interest and the role of media and the public interest. that it's very easy for us to kind of rely, fall back on freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of expression. All of those were constructed with an understanding of the public interest. And so this gets me to one of the questions I was going to ask you, which is about censorship. And I think that censorship is one of those, those kind of older tools in some ways that people continue to try to wield. Becomes the clarion call for people to say, "Oh, I'm being censored." It's part of cancel culture. It's part of all this, but it's censorship. The kind of way in which it's sedimented in law and in government is about the public interest in some way. So how is it? What do we, it seems like, there's the idea of censorship is you either are censored or you're not. And it just seems a lot more nuanced to me than that. So I thought maybe you could talk about that.
Yeah, you've hit the right button here for me. I mean, so look, where to start? It's such a great big question. Well, I'll say a few things about censorship right now. So one thing, I don't mean this as a political comment at all, but I think that we are just objectively witnessing one of the greatest efforts of censorship certainly in modern American history. And, we could go through the long list of things that constitute basically not just the shutting down of speakers, but the interruption of public debate, criticism of political figures. You could look at, especially academic freedom and what's happening in the universities. People at Penn know this extremely well. But everything we've seen over the last year really, I think, just highlights the degree to which we have a government right now that is seeking to silence speech. To my mind, that's classic censorship, right? It's shutting down speech, shutting down debate. In a university context, it's also shutting down critical thinking. So it's like a very deep form of censorship that we're witnessing. But the public debate is something, again, it goes back to the internet. I've thought about this for a long time. I've wondered, when will the debates over online speech and online censorship, which we think of as people who work on online speech, we don't think of it as censorship. It's content moderation, which we could talk about what that really means. But I've wondered for a long time, when would that debate over what speech online looks like, when would that kind of bleed into the public debate over what government responsibilities look like? I know it's backwards in a way, right? Because for many, many years, Zaid knows this really well, the question was to what extent should public norms or even public law, human rights law or domestic law, to what extent should that apply to content moderation? And by content moderation, I only mean the rules that companies, platforms adopt in order to determine, what's legitimate and what's illegitimate for speech online. So the long-term debate there has been, well, should human rights law apply to online space? Should the First Amendment, what are the rules there? But in online space, the questions they're not just about speakers. You can see very clearly how harassment or racism or misogyny, all sorts of forms of silencing, actually push people off the platform. So a platform could look at that and say, and actually, I think if we do a deeper cut, we could go through the human rights argument here, but a platform could say, we want this platform to be as open to as many voices as possible. And so harassment or misogyny or hate speech have no place on our platform. And I think they could make a legitimate argument for that. But those are arguments that aren't available to states, right? States can't just say, they can say whatever they want. I mean, we see that every day, but they can't just apply a law or a rule in a way that's inconsistent with what the law is, whether it's the First Amendment or human rights law. So you can't say, I mean, they do say it all the time, but they can't, they're not in a position to do what the platforms can do when it comes to, content moderation. A government can regulate, but it can't content moderate. Anyway, those things have kind of bled together in a lot of ways. And we see it used in good faith ways, I think, where there are some, and part of this comes up in the context of cancel culture, quote unquote, in the context where people are making arguments that, racism and racist attacks, even though the government doesn't, at least under the First Amendment, doesn't have the ability to impose a direct restriction on that, certainly if it doesn't constitute incitement to violence or to imminent threats in this country. Human rights law is a little bit different. That argument for more restrictions in the public space sounds a lot like the arguments that are made in online space. And I think the online debates have made that part a little bit easier. But so there's a sensorial element on one side, which is, I think, very different from the sensorial element that we see in this administration, which is more classically about, like, don't criticize public figures, and things like that, which look more like authoritarian threats to speech.
Right. And so I'm fond of saying this. My students hate it because it's really an unfair thing to say, but I'm always like to my students, especially my undergraduates, like, we made the internet. We created it, right? We can make it different. We can create it in a different way. We can resist a discourse of inevitability. It's just going to be the way it is. It's just always going to be that way. We can use our imaginations to make it seem like something else. But this is, so they hate that because then I'm like, it's up to you. Right. But I think, but I think that what you're saying too is like the difficulty in figuring out how to understand or interpret censorship, which is a historical kind of category that often was about freedom of speech, right? In a very specific historical moment that we don't really have the same. We need new tools. We need new routines. We need new journalistic routines. I'm not a journalist, but I think that journalism schools should have a complete overhaul. It's easy for me to say this because I'm not a journalist, just to be clear, of their curriculum. Yeah. How do we understand what information is? What is the life cycle of information? Why is it that information that used to be misinformation is now just information? Yeah. What is that life cycle? So could you fix that?
Yeah. Well, so I think actually people are thinking about how to fix that. And so one way to think about it is to look at what Europe is doing, right? So the European Union has adopted this thing called the Digital Services Act, which is basically a landmark regulation of the very largest platforms. And it only applies to the very largest platforms, basically platforms that have 45 million or more active daily users. And what they have done is basically they've said, we're not going to censor speech, but we believe there needs to be a new way of thinking about online space. And the way we're going to do it is by trying to crack open their opacity and make them visible so that people can actually understand how the platforms work, what algorithms they're using, what ways in which they are boosting disinformation or hate, so that people actually have a choice about the kinds of platforms they engage in. And also maybe have an idea about, like, what would a different platform look like? And it's very hard to do that if you don't have transparency about what these platforms are doing. So the DSA is trying to do that. The Trump administration and the House Judiciary Committee, led by Jim Jordan, and basically Elon Musk and, some others in the tech bro space, like they look at that and they say, that's censorship. And there's been one fine already imposed on X for 120 million euros for basically misleading the public about, the blue check marks and things like that. And that was, done by the EU. There's going to be another fine against X for, its Grok, basically for the kind of sexualization and basically child sexual abuse material that is circulating on X right now. So, people in the US, that community that I've described, I mean, they look at that and they say that's censorship. But it's actually, I think, a European model for how do we open up these platforms and how do we think about what a different internet would look like. But they're using other tools also. So the EU also, I don't want to be like, the EU guy here, but they are doing things. They're actually thinking about, they're not getting it right all the time. And at the state level, they do screw up every so often. But the other thing that they're doing, they adopted something called the Media Freedom Act. And the Media Freedom Act in the EU, which just entered into force last year, basically imposes obligations on states to, deal with concentrations of media, to ensure there's a pluralistic media environment, so there's access to more information. It includes protections for public media, which is the exact opposite of what the United States has done and this isn't just a Trump administration thing. Congress has, stripped funding of, Corporation for Public Broadcasting, for NPR. I mean, people are standing up for those institutions. So that's sort of a nice little silver lining that we've seen. But there are tools that we could use that are, they're statist, they're government oriented. There's also innovation that I think when you tell students you should be doing this, I know that's not how you're telling them, but that's true also. There should be room for innovation that creates a kind of safety net for people. And there are people thinking about, like, what would public interest social media look like? Mm-hmm. So there are ideas out there. We need to create space for them. The EU is thinking about it one way. I mean, more or less the United States, even before this administration, wasn't doing anything active to create room for pluralist media, and we should be doing some of that. We should be planning for the moment when that's available to us.
Yeah, I think one of the things that has been a real block, a real challenge to thinking in, like, having a new sort of imagination about what our media landscape can look like, is the idea that anything that questions, the corporate mentality of platform, of ownership, of media ownership, is seen as like a moral panic, or a kind of socialist understanding, just because you would like some kind of moderation or some kind of transparency. I mean, I think that also we need to historicize. We need to remember history. I mean, Musk, as soon as he bought Twitter, fired the director of trust and truth, or safety, trust and safety. And Annenberg grad, by the way, just want to make sure that everyone knows that. Trust and safety. He fired him immediately and said, we don't need this anymore. And so it's not as if we haven't had models that we can rely on. And so instead of kind of, allowing, people to say, well, we're in a moral panic when we say we're worried about kids, we're worried about Grok. I mean, Grok is doing, what you can do with Grok is absolutely despicable, and women are going to pay the price, and marginalized people are going to pay the price. They already are. We can look at that and say, we're not interested in censoring every bit of speech, but we are interested in some nuance. And I think that in your writing too, you talk about transparency. And I think that that's a key finding here, because you also say that, a lot of what's happening in the US in terms of tech power, which is what we're talking about here, is about power. It's not about protection.
Yeah.
It's not about protection. It is about power. And to think about, being more transparent, the DSA in Europe, there have been mistakes with that too, right? But the DSA is saying, let's break open the shiny black box that is the algorithm. I mean, I'm a media scholar. I don't know how algorithms work, because it's been really easy for me to not know how algorithms work. That's not what I do, right? But it's and it just seems so insurmountable to understand that. And I think that more transparency and more translation would really kind of, create a new context for this.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I mean, you cited me, so of course I agree with that. But there, the moment I think is complicated by the fact that the polarization in the free speech debate makes some of these points complicated. So just to give an example, Australia, which former Prime Minister Rudd was here yesterday. Australia adopted recently a ban on social media for kids 16 and under. And to my mind, that's really problematic. I mean, I get it. I mean, this has been, Australia has an Online Safety Act. The UK has an Online Safety Act. It's driven by something that's real, which is this fear that social media provides tools for kids for self-harm, for kind of, intra, community, if we can say that, harassment by kids against kids, bullying. I mean, all of that stuff is real. But, children also have rights of access to information. So these, kind of draconian bans on social media are problematic. And, a 7-year-old is different from a 16-year-old. How do we think those things through in the context of, making the internet better? It's not easy to do that, but I think that so the EU struggled for a long time over, should they go the, ban route, ban disinformation, ban social media for kids, and they ended up with this transparency approach. Whereas the UK is going a little bit more towards, I think, heading towards a ban. Others might go that way too, like Australia. And I think that is setting us up for, real hostility to children's rights. Preferencing, I mean, I don't want to overstate this, but kind of preferencing parental rights over children's rights when, 15-year-olds have needs of access to information and development of critical thinking that, yes, I agree, you won't develop critical thinking by spending all your time on X or on Facebook or wherever. I guess kids aren't on Facebook. I mean,
they're not.
Pinterest, Pinterest has made a comeback.
It's come back.
TikTok, but those aren't places to develop critical thinking. So there's a way in which I think your notion of what is the way to build a better internet, we could be thinking about different kinds of internets, different platforms that can really help, develop creativity, curiosity without, the harassment. I don't have a silver bullet for that, but I think I'd rather us be heading in that direction as opposed to the direction of just banning it for kids.
Yeah, I think that this also, what you're suggesting too is a much more nuanced, multi-layered, contextual approach to technology, right? I mean, banning technology is really saying that technology is the problem, right? Whereas there's a lot of other problems that go into why someone would ban technology from kids, and I think, that and you can start to see some of that. I mean, I'm part of the democracy pillar at Perry World House, and a lot of the work that people come and present there is on political polarization and political, we talk about affective polarization, which is basically just saying and taking to the internet to say it, I just don't like you. You're awful. Oh, I don't care if we have actually some sort of commonality in what we think is right for the public. I don't like you, so I'm going to go online and I'm going to talk about how horrible you are, right? So it's issues, political context, political nuance is completely out the window. It becomes an individual kind of, demonization, right? And it is enabled by technology, right? But politics plays a role in it. And so I think that, one of the things that at least I'm trying to think about as I remake the internet. By the way, you heard it here first. I'm redoing it. I'm reimagining it. No, I love to come and tell other people to do it for me. But one of the things I'm trying to think about is how to build that sort of contextual approach to thinking about technology. That it's not that search it has cultural norms built into it. It's not just a tool, it's not just a mechanism. And I think that a lot of what you've been saying about freedom of expression is about that nuanced approach. And I think I'm supposed to open up for questions about now. Is that right? Yes. Okay. So, yes. So thank you. This is great. Yes, Michael. Yeah. Are you, Lauren, you're the mic person? Okay. Yeah.
Thank you so much. This is a question, David. You mentioned a couple of times contrasting between First Amendment law and human rights law, and you mentioned EU law too. I'm just curious, because I think those of us that are thinking about what more resources are available than what we grew up on, which is First Amendment law, could you talk more about the human rights law approach to these issues?
Oh, could I talk about the human rights? It's like a candy, like
précis,
giving candy to a baby. So the précis is so. Like I was saying before, First Amendment is kind of speaker, at least for the cultural understanding, but also in a lot of the legal approaches. First Amendment is very speaker driven, and human rights law, under Article 19, like I was saying, is multidimensional. Right. So it's audience rights and also speaker rights. I mean, those things are not meant to be in tension so much. There should be expansive rights under human rights law as under First Amendment law. One of the things that, I think that in part because the First Amendment is written in absolutist terms, Congress shall make no law. The thing you get from human rights law, which I think is a subject of disquiet for some people, certainly for Americans, is that it's not framed necessarily as an absolute right. So the right is, seek, receive, and impart information, ideas of all kinds. Everyone is guaranteed that. But the next paragraph of Article 19, the article that protects freedom of expression, basically says that rights come with responsibilities and duties. I actually hate that line because it's so abstract, but then it's more specific, and it says essentially that limitations can be placed on expression where those limitations are provided by law. So there's like a rule of law element to the restriction, and they're necessary and proportionate in order to achieve a legitimate objective. And the legitimate objectives are laid out. They're very specific. It's protection of the rights or reputations of others, protection of national security or public order or public health or morals. Now, we could pick apart, especially the public morals part, but it provides kind of a way of thinking about freedom of expression or free speech in a broader context. It actually gives us a way to think about, okay, you can restrict speech, but only if it's in existing law, only if that law is clear enough to provide guidance. So, it provides guidance to the individual speaker or person seeking information, but also provides a limitation on the discretion of the state. And it's necessary. So the rule has to actually be effective and sort of the last resort, because the default should be freedom of expression. It's a last resort in order to, and then you look at like, what are the grounds that are being asserted? Is it privacy? So maybe there's a rule against doxing. Well, it's in a First Amendment context. Again, there's a ton of jurisprudence that you would bring into that, but at least on the surface level, it's harder to understand where, because we don't have a constitutional right of privacy in its specific terms. There was an effort, but that doesn't seem to have gone far enough. But in human rights law, you have a right to privacy. So like the idea of doxing, you can actually think through in human rights terms in ways that are much harder to think through in US constitutional terms. And frankly, Europeans and actually most of the rest of the world, certainly in the democratic world, but even in authoritarian societies, activists, human rights defenders use this language of human rights law in order to make arguments for freedom of expression. And they don't find much value in the First Amendment approach. It seems too absolutist, even though it's not truly absolutist, but it seems, I think it's the way it's been promoted culturally by Americans is actually more the absolutist Elon Musk cartoon version of what free speech means. So human rights law is just for me, provides it's a richer definition of freedom of expression, but also like a more, like a clearer, better articulated way of thinking about and analyzing when restrictions are plausible or legitimate.
Just to follow up really quick, I think that we didn't really get into this, although we talked about it the other day, that part of human rights, part of that tension that you asked about is really contained in the word or the concept of speech, that it's not about listening. It's not about that, a kind of critical listening as being a responsibility in any kind of context of freedom of expression. And so your focus on like the audience, not just the speaker, I think is really crucial.
Yeah. And it gives you another way of thinking. Like we think First Amendment and also much of civil and political rights as a matter of human rights law forces us to think in negative terms, right? So what the government can't do. But if everyone is guaranteed the right to seek, receive, and impart information, well, then you could also think about positive things that the state should do. So what do we expect? And the First Amendment doesn't help us at all, really, on this. But human rights law does, because it allows us to think about, okay, what's the environment that government should be helping to foster so that, there's independent media, there's pluralist voices, there's debate that people can access, that there's, ways for people to distinguish disinformation from, accurate information. Like none of that is like, if we have a real legitimate, honest conversation in the United States about, what steps government could take to do that, we'd immediately get thrown into, the First Amendment, government shouldn't be involved at all.
So we've been talking about freedom of expression primarily in kind of a binary way where it's like the speaker either can speak or not, or the audience has access to information or they don't. But, as a consumer of media today, I feel like my freedom of expression is very, very largely driven by prioritization processes. So all media are both gatekeepers, but they're also prioritizers. Now it's largely algorithmic. But I feel like I don't know and we have all these rights about like what we should have access to, the gatekeeper piece. But are there specific rights we have, human rights, constitutional rights, whatever, to prioritization processes like algorithms?
So that's a really good, deep question. I mean, there's actually an argument that like whether we call them, prioritization or sorting mechanisms or recommendation systems. So actually one of the things the DSA does is it obligates companies to not only be transparent about these processes, these sorting and prioritization processes, but also it basically says to the companies, you need to assess the risks that your systems might pose to society. And so if you want to think about prioritization in a human rights term, like we might think of it in the disinformation context, right? So, to what extent are platforms prioritizing information that through its algorithmic processes and its recommendation processes, which become increasingly personalized, to what extent does that boost disinformation? And to what extent, like, could you make an argument that that boosting of disinformation actually serves to interfere with your ability to access accurate information? So you could start to think of, the issue of prioritization through the lens of, well, is a platform actually interfering with my right of access to information? Now, I don't want to make the argument here that government should interfere in the specific process of saying this information should be prioritized over others. That's a very dangerous road to go down. But opening up that process, opening up, sort of the systemic risks that might be posed to, the EU and the DSA calls it civic discourse. That at least gives us a lens into thinking through these problems. But they are, if access to information is a human right, as I think it is under Article 19 and under Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights, then, this at least gives us a way to think about maybe not what government should prevent, but what government can do to ensure that companies are taking the right steps to, again, not prioritize certain information over other information, but to provide the ability for individuals to see what the problems are, to see what that prioritization looks like. There's another right that we could talk about, but I want to open up for more questions. But Article 19 also guarantees everyone's right to an opinion, basically to maintain opinions without interference. That is what we think of as a non-derogable right. There could be no restriction, even in a state of emergency that interferes with the life of the nation. You can't interfere with the right of opinion. Disinformation, there are increasing studies about disinformation and algorithmic sorting that actually suggests an interference with the ability of individuals to develop an opinion. And it's a very early stage, at least on the research side, and on the jurisprudential side, there's almost nothing. But that is one way to start to think about like how the sorting, how the prioritization could actually have a human rights element to it.
Ask your question and we'll take 2 questions. Sure. Okay, that's great. Yeah. David, thank you. Sarah, wonderful. There's a myth, a story of the emperor has no clothes. And in the kind of climax of the story, the emperor rides out, he's naked, everybody knows it, nobody's saying it, but a child with no skin in the game says something that everybody knows, but they don't realize that everybody else knows it. So the idea is that group knowing shapes our relationships to each other. And Sarah, since you're redoing the internet, I'd love to hear maybe briefly both of your thoughts about design. It sounds to me like a lot of the debates about free speech are almost as if we're replicating a virtual world from an analog world. But you looked at me when you said transparency, and we're in the same room together. And I would never say, for a variety of reasons and layers, but the way that we behave together is not the way that we behave when all of the things that you've said. So I'd really be curious, what would be the design elements, knowing that it's not just speaking, it's knowing, it's holding things together as different types of communities. Mm-hmm. What would the design principles look like? Thank you. That was a beautiful question. My question is more from the end of someone who grew up with the internet. So something that was said that really resonated or something I agree with is the fact that we made the internet, that it is shaped by how we use it as humans, what we make of it. So in that end, I'm just curious, how useful is it really to be using regulation policy laws on corporations or even governments to resolve issues like body shaming or violence or polarization on the media, or at least treating them or tech as the cause, as opposed to using it as a tool for the real cause, which is how humans use these tools? So I'm just kind of curious and how we can really address that.
first? Or?
You can go first. Yeah.
Um,
Your show.
No, these are both like really, I agree, beautiful question. Great questions. So like I think there are just real limitations to the internet as a space for connection. I mean, one of the things I worry about at the big picture level is, we don't have enough of these gatherings. I mean, we do. I've actually been amazed. I've only been here a couple of days, and there's like a lot of human interaction. Actually, you should be very proud of what you have here. I mean, I've been at other universities that don't attract, and maybe it's a sort of a special thing about Perry Worldhouse, but I've been in a lot of places that there's just much more online, less community, and I still think it's not just analog; it's physical community is really important. It's important for human development. It's important for like understanding the culture of an organization where you work, like all of those things remain important. And I think to the extent that like we try to replicate those things online, my guess is that we will fail. So I really want to find ways to, ensure that the internet, and I don't think platforms, I mean, 10 years from now, I'm sure that we won't be talking about the same social media platforms that we have right now. I certainly hope we won't be. But the internet as a tool for access to information, for developing critical thinking skills, like I think like that has to be, to my mind, what we should be thinking about. Like, how is the internet, how does it develop so that it's a tool for democracy rather than a tool for atomization and posturing and, body shaming, misogyny, racial discrimination? Like, how do we do that? I mean, the truth is, I think, Sarah, you were suggesting this before. I mean, the internet is about society, right? It's not just a technology. It's replicating social problems and social norms. And I don't think we can expect it to be the tool that solves all of those problems, but it shouldn't be the place to make them worse. And so how do we address that? I think that, like, to my mind, that is the big question for internet policy over the next, decades. And unfortunately, because of the political situation in this country, any effort to address it is essentially dominated by people who don't want it to change because they have a business interest in it. And that's something that I think we'll be able to overcome it over time. But, it's pretty hard when you have a potential trillionaire in our future who's, very involved in shaping a particular part of the internet and internet policy for the United States. That's something we need to overcome.
Super great questions, really hard questions, and I think about them a lot. I agree with everything that you just said. I think that, and this is like magical thinking. Okay, if we could see, I'm just giving you my magical thinking. I think in order for us to have what you suggested, which is community, social norms, cultural norms, as sort of bonding about public issues, solidarity, care for each other, compassion, those are really, really, really hard things to market. Hate is a lot easier. Misogyny is super easy to market. Body shaming is the easiest, And so in my magical thinking, we recenter these media platforms around collectivity and not around the individual. And that means, like, even the New Yorker cartoon that you brought up at the beginning, on the internet, no one knows I'm a dog, is already about the individual. It is about the individual and being able, even if it was utopic and being able to express oneself and everything, if we could reimagine the internet as a space that questions prioritization, that doesn't just kind of give in to the fact that, oh, on my Instagram I just was talking about this pair of shoes and now they're on my internet and now I'm going to buy them, and it's all customized and we're all prioritized and recommended, and our information diet is so intensely curated. If we need to let go of that, and that's a consumer, I think, mindset. That's a mindset of capitalism this is about how I can benefit from it. And so again, in magical thinking, we would recenter the subject of media, the media landscape, as the collective, not the individual user. And I think that I will say that I've done a lot of work on body shaming, and my students do work on misogyny and racism online. And you know what helps more than anything else? It's traumatic work, because it's horrible to read these kinds of things. Is we have workshops where we go over it together and we talk about it together, my students and I. And I know that's not exactly what you're asking, but the solidarity of talking to someone, of not being ashamed of who you are because someone told you should be, it actually allows you to alleviate the trauma a little bit. And that's about community, and that's about collectivity, and not like having to face this alone. And I think so. I mean, I think that's, maybe an easy answer to your question. It's harder to do because we are so used to doing everything on our own. But I really think that reimagining this space as one that doesn't center the individual and thus doesn't leave us out there alone, I think is the key.
A round of applause for our speakers. Thank you both for being here.
Thanks, everyone.